There are 18,000 species of butterflies and 160,000 species of moths in the world, a total biodiversity of 178,000 species. In the UK, there are 60 species of butterflies and 2,500 of moths. That's 2,560 species, or 1.5% of the world total of butterflies and moths. Today we talk about working with butterflies and moths. Dr. Richard Fox is Associate Director of Recording and Monitoring at the UK charity Butterfly Conservation. I began by asking what jobs there are of
nature conservation, research in museums with collections, ecological consultants, giving advice regarding planning applications and that kind of thing. Butterfly houses at zoos and also sometimes just sort of independent.
Rick, you work with butterflies. Please can you describe your career from start to date?
I did a degree in zoology. I then quite quickly did a master's degree, 1 year in nature conservation. And then I started working in nature conservation, mainly in sort of practical stuff, wellies on, chainsaw in hand, out managing sites to benefit wildlife and people coming to sites to enjoy wildlife. I had a shortish break in doing some travelling, which of course is where we met. And then when I came back from that, I got the job that I still have. So this was back in 1997. I started working for the UK charity Butterfly Conservation, which does what its name suggests. Really, it's a charity that focuses on conservation of butterflies and moths, because they're all the same thing. I mean, butterflies are just a special sort of moth, really. And I've been doing that ever since. So however many years that is, like 20, getting on for 25 years.
Rick, what has been your proudest moment working with butterflies?
Job is very desk-based kind of job. It's about collecting data and organising the systems, the schemes through which members of the public, enthusiasts, and other people can contribute sightings that we can then turn into information that helps conservation and scientific research. So I think probably the highlights have been using that data to produce books. I've been lucky enough to work on 3 books now, and a number of other reports. So every sort of 5 or 6 years, we produce Butterfly Conservation produces a State of the UK's Butterflies report, where we review all of the evidence, all of the trends for how our different butterfly species are faring. And we usually have a nice launch with the key volunteers that have helped gather that data, but also with people like Sir David Attenborough. So standing on he's the president of Butterfly Conservation. So I've had the great fortune on quite a few occasions to be stood on a platform alongside Sir David. Him doing a little speech about why it's so important, me doing a little speech about how what our research has showed, how butterflies are faring, to an audience of the great and good.
Rick, what's your biggest guilty pleasure at work?
I suppose, as someone who's worked from home for a long time, and this will be familiar to all of the many people who've been working at home since the pandemic started. But there are elements of my work that I can take out into the garden. If I need to read a report or comment on something that someone's written, or just catch up on reading scientific papers, then it's 5 yards from my desk where I'm sitting now, into the sunshine, hopefully in the garden, where I can sit and work, listening to the birds' song and perhaps even seeing a butterfly flip by.
And what's your best butterfly fact, please?
moths have evolved hearing, and this has evolved independently many times in the evolution of moths and butterflies. So they've evolved what we can call ears. They're on all sorts of different parts of their bodies, which is partly reflects the fact that they've evolved multiple times. And the conventional thinking for a long time was that they'd evolved this hearing ability, these ears, in response to predation by bats. Obviously, many bats feed on insects, and I suspect everyone watching this will be aware that those bats use echolocation to hunt their prey at night. And so moths that have evolved hearing can often detect these echolocation calls of bats and use that to take evasive action. And so moths and bats are involved in a sort of evolutionary arms race, trying to outcompete each other, with the bats trying to evolve ever more sophisticated ways of catching their prey, and the moths trying to evolve ever more sophisticated ways of avoiding being a snack. And it's really quite fascinating how they do it. So some moths will hear a bat coming, and they'll either go into a really erratic flight to try and dodge the incoming bat. Some will stop flying, will deliberately stall and just drop into the vegetation. But others, particularly some of the tiger moths, have kind of pushed back even further, and they now produce sounds of their own, which we think jam the echolocation calls of the bat, or at least confuse the bat, or possibly even warn the bat that the moth is toxic or has nasty tasting chemicals in its body, the way that a brightly colored insect might warn a daytime predator like a bird that you shouldn't eat me, I'm nasty. Obviously colors don't work at night, so it's possible that sound is doing that job. But just to come back, I kind of hinted at the start of that very long and rambling now answer that it's widely thought that moths evolved this hearing in response to bats, but there was a recent paper suggesting that that's not true, and that actually moths could hear a long time before bats existed, and indeed certainly before bats used echolocation for hunting. So they probably evolved their hearing for other things, but they certainly use it in this arms race, this kind of battle, a never-ending nightly battle against bats.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. I didn't know that. What are the skills, experiences, and personal qualities that have been key to your work with butterflies and moths?
I mean, I'm a scientist, so obviously scientific skills and training have been vital to that. I'm an ecologist. I'm a scientist that studies ecology, which is obviously about how living organisms interact with their environment, with the non-living parts of the environment, and indeed with each other. I'm also a conservationist, of course. I'm working for a nature conservation charity, and my background prior to that was in nature conservation as well. Probably last but not least, I'm a lepidopterist, because the focus of all my work is on butterflies and moths. And indeed, it's a huge hobby of mine as well. When I'm not actually working on butterflies and moths, especially probably because my work is desk-based, then I like to get out and see, find and photograph and enjoy looking at, and indeed make recorded sightings of butterflies and moths to contribute to the data. So scientific skills definitely one, but as I mentioned earlier, my job is very much about engaging people, volunteers, members of the public, to gather data on butterflies and moths across the whole of the UK. So communication skills are really important, being able to deal with people as well as data. And in terms of sort of personal things, I guess just like a passion, a real passion for conservation, for biodiversity conservation, and indeed for the focal animals, in this case butterflies and moths, which are amazing and fantastic creatures. in case you weren't aware.
Rick, do you need a degree to work with butterflies and moths?
Not necessarily, I think. I think most jobs in conservation, certainly anything on the sort of the more sciencey side of things, would probably expect a degree. But I think nowadays, and indeed many of them might expect some kind of postgraduate degree, a master's degree. You know, it's often, if not always, the case that equivalent experience and skills will substitute for that. So, you know, I have colleagues who don't have degrees, but have, you know, and indeed have past careers in completely unrelated industries, but who have a passion for butterflies and moths, and who bring really important skills that we need in the organization, like data skills, you know, which, you know, you don't necessarily gain from, you know, a hobby of wandering around the countryside looking at wildlife. You don't necessarily gain massive skills in creating and maintaining databases, for example, or in communication skills. So, you know, there are certainly ways that people can jump careers from, you know, what might be thought of as more traditional careers to something a bit more quirky but very fulfilling, like nature conservation, without having a qualification, you know, a formal degree in ecology or, you know, environmental science or something.
Rick, you are a scientist, you're an ecologist, working full-time for butterfly and moth conservation with the charity Butterfly Conservation. Which books or people or meetings have most influenced your thinking?
I do read a lot of scientific papers to keep my sort of knowledge of the field up to date. There's quite an old book now called The Sand Country Almanac by an American guy called Aldo Leopold, which is a really beautiful book about sort of conservation, but not like organizational conservation, but about the sort of personal sort of ethics and almost sort of spirituality of conservation that I read quite a lot of times, found that really inspiring. There was a really good ecology book. I don't know whether you can still get it, but sort of for simple ecology, called Why Big Fierce Animals Are Scarce, by a guy called Paul Colinvaux. I think that's how you pronounce it. And that was really inspiring. Ecology is all about asking questions, you know. There's one called The Butterfly Isles by a guy called Patrick Barkham, who's a brilliant writer. And that's about his sort of personal quest. He kind of took a year off. He's a journalist for The Guardian, and he took a year off to go around Britain trying to see every butterfly species that occurs in Britain, and, you know, meeting people that are passionate about those insects along the way. And there's a recently published moth sort of equivalent called Much Ado About Mothing by a guy called James Lowen. There are 2,500 species of moths in the UK alone. But he went to find rare species where there's a lot of conservation work going on, and other sort of inspiring species.
I was going to ask later on, is there a basic text for people who are considering this line of career? So that's answered that one.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that would certainly give you a feel for the world of moth recorders and people, you know, enthusiasts more than sort of professionals probably, but certainly it's got quite a lot of conservation stuff in it as well. I mean, there are standard sort of textbooks and obviously field guides, identification books about British butterflies and moths as well. There are lots of them. There are some really good ones.
Rick, what is your view of working with butterflies and moths today?
Nature conservation, working in nature conservation as a career has you know, increased hugely. The opportunities have increased hugely, and there's been a huge growth both in degree courses, postgraduate courses, and indeed in opportunities to work with nature conservation organisations. So that side of things has definitely increased.
Rick, how do you see things changing over the next 10 years in the ecological field?
My sort of actual field of work we call biological recording. So it's about gathering data, gathering sightings, and then using that data to inform decisions, to inform policy, to help prioritize conservation, to inform decisions about, where a housing estate is built, or where new trees might be planted, or all of that kind of stuff. And the need for that is as great as it's ever been. So I think that field of biological recording will continue, but there are certainly some cutting edge technologies that are already influencing that work and will continue to move quite rapidly over the next decade. Just to pick out a couple, one of them is the use of environmental DNA to monitor organisms. So this is not extracting DNA from a living organism, but picking up traces of DNA that are left by organisms in the environment. So it's non-invasive, non-harmful sampling. And most of it so far has been done in the aquatic, in water. So you can take samples of water from ponds and you can analyze them to detect the presence of great crested newts, which are a protected species, because great crested newts leave their DNA in the water. And they can be done for fisheries management and things in lakes and rivers. But it's also starting to be used in the terrestrial world now as well. I read a recent paper taking DNA from flowers to establish which insects had visited and pollinated those flowers. So that's one sort of high-tech thing that's coming in. Another is the use of automated identification. So to identify insects, even in Britain, which has a small number of insects certainly compared to most countries, and a tiny amount compared to the tropics. We have something around 25,000 species of insects in Britain, and many of them are really difficult to identify. And there are, for most groups, butterflies, we're fortunate, they're an easy group. There are only 60 or so species in Britain, and thousands upon thousands of people are competent at identifying those butterfly species. Moths, I mentioned, there are 2,500 species. Some of them are really tricky, but they're really popular. There's been a huge growth in enthusiasts interested in moth recording and studying and just enjoying seeing moths. So again, we get a lot of data coming through, but there are lots of other insect groups in Britain where it's very difficult to get good data, and there's a lot of work going into basically computers doing that for us. Computers being able to recognize from images of insects, the identity of those insects. Now, it's got a long way to go still, but I have mixed feelings about it, because I would hate to see that replace the skill and the enjoyment of natural history, of learning, of going out and learning the names of plants and animals and just enjoying them, because obviously that's a key part of conservation. That if people aren't interested in the animals and plants that they see around them, then they'll have no interest in wanting to protect them and conserve them. So I would hate to think that we ever get to a point where all of the data is gathered by computers and AI and people have no role in it. But it's certainly something that is, being developed.
Somebody who is perhaps finishing a course, or wanting a career change, or a school leaver who is considering going into biological monitoring as a career, what advice can you give that person?
Having studied those elements, as part of a course, or if you haven't done that, then perhaps, considering taking some extra courses to, have that basic knowledge, those basic skills of recording and monitoring biodiversity. would be critical. Trying to get some practical experience, so doing voluntary work with your local wildlife trust, with the National Trust, but also thinking about transferable skills. It's really important that when you're applying for jobs that you highlight those transferable skills. Careers and jobs in nature conservation or biological recording or ecology more generally require people skills.
Rick, thank you very much indeed for being on the Practical Animal channel. Richard Fox.
You're welcome. Thanks very much for having me.
So, as Rick mentioned in the interview, the skills for working with butterflies and moths include communication skills, that is, people skills, and he also mentioned several books for reading for knowing more about butterflies and moths. For a general overview of ecology, read Why Big Fierce Animals Are Rare by Paul Collinville. You could also try reading The Butterfly Isles by Patrick Barker. And as regards the future of butterfly work, he mentioned the use of environmental DNA as non-invasive monitoring. Thanks for watching.